The medal that wasn't hers, the East Room of the White House East Room shimmered with light. Flags stood tall behind the podium. Medals gleamed beneath the chandeliers. Cameras flashed as journalists waited for the moment. At the front of the room stood Donald Trump, preparing to present a commendation to a decorated Air Force officer whose bravery had saved dozens of lives during a classified mission overseas. Her name was Captain Reina Torres, 30 years old, calm, disciplined, and widely respected. Trump stepped to the microphone. "Today we honor courage," he began, his voice carrying to the hall. "But sometimes courage doesn't just come from the battlefield." Applause filled the room as Reina approached in her crisp dress blues. But something was different. She wasn't smiling. Trump lifted the medal. Before he could place it around her neck, Reina slowly raised her hand. The room fell silent. "Mr. President," she said quietly, "I cannot accept this award." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Secret Service agents stiffened. Reporters leaned forward. Camera lenses zoomed in. Trump lowered the medal slightly, confusion crossing his face. "Why not, Captain?" Reina's voice trembled, but her gaze never wavered. "Because this medal doesn't belong to me." The silence deepened. "It belongs to someone we all forgot." Trump narrowed his eyes. "Who?" Reina took a breath. "A man who wore the uniform with pride, who saved my life, and who died without recognition." She turned toward the audience. His name was Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks. Murmurs spread through the room. Some people exchanged puzzled looks. "Elijah Brooks," she repeated. "Many of you knew him as the janitor at Arlington Air Base." Now the murmurs grew louder. Everyone remembered the quiet, elderly man who cleaned the officer dormitories. Polite, soft-spoken, almost invisible. But he was much more than that, Reina continued. He was a veteran, a decorated soldier, and the man who once saved my life. Trump folded his hands and listened carefully. Reina's eyes glistened. "I first met Elijah when I was a brand-new lieutenant. I was overwhelmed, reckless, and after a training accident that nearly cost lives, I was sitting alone in a hallway crying. He didn't lecture me," she said. "He simply sat beside me and told me a story." She paused. A story about Vietnam, about courage, about saving his entire unit. But when he came home, there were no celebrations, no recognition, no second chances. Reina turned toward the audience. "So I ask you, why was Elijah Brooks a janitor instead of colonel? Why did we walk past him every day and never ask who he was?" A tear slid down her cheek. "Because we judge people by titles, by uniforms, not by the service in their hearts." The room felt heavier with every word. "Before he died last year," she continued, "Elijah made me promise something." Her voice cracked. He said, "Don't let them forget who we were. Remind them that some heroes wear rags, not ribbons." She looked at the medal still resting in the president's hand. "I can't accept this, sir, until the country sees a man who deserved it more than I ever could." Then she stepped back. The room remained frozen in stunned silence. The video spread across the country within hours. Every news network replayed the moment. Social media exploded with one question: who was Elijah Brooks? At Arlington Air Base, officers whispered in break rooms. The janitor? He worked here for 20 years. He never talked about his past. Reina stood in front of Elijah's old locker. No one had touched it since he passed away. She opened it slowly. Inside were worn boots, a folded American flag, and a faded photograph of a young soldier in uniform. There was also an envelope. Written on the front were the words, "To the one who listens." Back in her quarters, Reina opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. "You once asked why I never asked for more. It began, it's simple. I serve the man beside me, not for medals. But if you ever get the chance, tell them we were here. Tell them we mattered." Reina wiped tears from her eyes. She pulled out Elijah's personnel file, one she had quietly copied years earlier. Inside were commendations, most stamped with the same word: denied. She knew what she had to do. This wasn't about a medal anymore. It was about restoring a forgotten legacy. The next morning, she walked into the United States Department of Defense with Elijah's file in hand. I'm requesting a formal review of Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks' commendation history, she told the records clerk. The clerk barely glanced up. The file's closed, he muttered. He died a year ago. No surviving family. Raina leaned forward. He was denied honors he earned. That matters more than paperwork. The clerk sighed. Happened a lot with Vietnam vets, especially minorities. Raina, clench your fists. All the more reason to fix it. He finally looked at her. Submit a DD 149, but don't hold your breath. So she submitted the form, and then she began searching for anyone who had served with Elijah. One name stood out, Colonel Wallace Benton. When she finally reached him, his voice shook. Elijah Brooks, he whispered. I thought he died in Vietnam. Raina told him the story. There was a long pause. Then Benton said quietly, he saved my life. If you're bringing his story to light, I'm with you. And just like that, the first domino fell. Weeks later, Raina received a call from the White House. The president wanted to meet privately. Inside the Oval Office, Trump stood by the window. You made quite a statement, Captain, he said. Raina saluted. Yes, sir. He turned. I read Elijah's file. I didn't know. Most people didn't, she replied. She handed him Elijah's journal. Trump flipped through the pages slowly. This man was a hero, he said quietly. Raina nodded. He didn't want recognition, but the country needs to know men like him existed. Trump tapped the desk thoughtfully. I think we honor him publicly. Raina looked up. A new medal, he continued, for soldiers whose service was overlooked. And the first recipient will be Elijah Brooks. Her eyes widened. Sir, are you serious? He nodded. Very. And I want you to lead it. Months later, a new honor was announced. The Elijah Brooks Medal for Silent Valor, created for soldiers whose bravery had gone unseen. The first ceremony took place at Arlington National Cemetery. Before a crowd of veteran soldiers and families, Captain Raina Torres stood beside Elijah's grave. This time, she held the medal. And for the first time in history, the quiet soldier who spent decades cleaning hallways finally received the honor he had earned, not in silence, but in thunder. Here is a polished rewrite of the final part of your story, ***, keeping the meaning but improving flow, emotion, and clarity. The Medal of Silent Valor, final chapter. Elijah's grave was simple. No military markings, no honors, just a quiet headstone resting among thousands of others at Arlington National Cemetery. Captain Raina Torres knelt beside it. They see you now, Sergeant, she whispered softly, and soon the whole world will know what you stood for. A gentle wind moved through the trees, rustling the leaves above as if the earth itself approved. Her phone buzzed. It was the White House. The voice on the line was unmistakable. Donald Trump spoke directly. The ceremony is next week, Captain. Bring your speech and bring the journal. Raina looked back at the headstone. I'll bring Elijah, sir. Hashtag the night before history. The night before the ceremony, Raina stood alone in the auditorium where history would unfold the next day. The stage held only one object, a small velvet box resting on a pedestal. Inside it lay the Elijah Brooks Medal of Silent Valor. The lights hadn't been tested yet. The hall was dark and quiet, almost sacred. As she walked across the stage, a young airman approached nervously. Captain Torres? She turned. Yes. My grandfather served with Elijah Brooks, the airman said. He used to tell stories about a soldier who saved men under enemy fire. I always thought they were exaggerations until your speech. Raina smiled gently. He saved more than lives, she said. He saved our honor. Hashtag the ceremony. The next morning, the grounds of Arlington filled with veterans, families, and soldiers standing in perfect formation. Photographers lined the pathways. Yet the event was not flashy. It was solemn, respectful. President Trump stepped to the podium, placing Elijah's journal beside his prepared remarks. I presented many awards, he said slowly. But today we correct something far more important, a nation's memory. He paused and looked toward Raina, seated in the front row. Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks was a hero, not because someone said so, but because his fellow soldiers lived because of him. Raina felt tears rise in her eyes. We failed to recognize him in his lifetime, Trump continued. But we will never forget him again. He turned toward her. Captain Reina Torres, will you do the honors? Reina stood and walked to the podium. She opened the velvet box and lifted the medal high so the crowd could see. This medal, she said, voice steady but emotional, belongs to every silent warrior who gave everything and asked for nothing. The crowd erupted into applause, but many were crying. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag a movement begins. Something extraordinary happened after that day. Across the country, veterans began coming forward. Stories poured in, stories of forgotten medics, cooks who carried wounded soldiers to safety, mechanics who shielded comrades from explosions, engineers who never came home. Reina received hundreds of letters. One read, "My father served under Brooks in Vietnam. He used to talk about a ghost who saved their unit. Now I know who that ghost was." Another letter said, "I'm a black veteran who was overlooked for years. Thank you for reminding the world that some heroes are ignored, but never unworthy." Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the Silent Valor Project. Reina created a foundation called the Silent Valor Project. Its mission was simple: find forgotten heroes, honor them, restore their place in history. She traveled everywhere, schools, veterans' halls, conferences around the world. And everywhere she went, she carried Elijah's journal. The words he wrote in silence were now being heard across the nation. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag a letter from the president. Weeks later, a package arrived at her base. Inside was a handwritten letter from President Trump. "Captain Torres, I've spoken with the Joint Chiefs. We're naming a wing at Arlington Air Base after Elijah Brooks. Congress is also reviewing legislation to examine military records for discrimination-related omissions. You lit the spark. History now has its eyes open. Proud of you. Donald J. Trump." Reina held the letter close. Elijah Brooks' name wasn't just remembered. It was changing the future. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag a brother remembered. Colonel Wallace Benton, now 85 and in a wheelchair, later visited Elijah's grave with Reina. He saluted the headstone. Tears streamed down his face. "I thought he died decades ago," Benton said quietly. "Turns out he lived a whole second life, and none of us knew." Reina placed the medal gently at the base of the grave. He never asked for recognition. Benton nodded. No, but the country needed to give it. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag a nation learned his name. That year's Memorial Day was unlike any before. Across the nation, Elijah Brooks' name was spoken on national broadcasts. A new monument was unveiled honoring unsung heroes. At the Lincoln Memorial, Reina delivered the keynote address. "He was never called sir, never marched in parades," she said. "But make no mistake, Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks marched through history. Millions watched. Veterans saluted their screens. One man's forgotten life had awakened a nation's conscience." Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the empty chair. Later, after the Pentagon, a conference room was named after Elijah Brooks. Inside stood a single empty chair. During the dedication, Reina explained its meaning. "This chair is reserved for the unheard," she said. "For every veteran we fail to see. Let it remind us to always ask one question. Who did we forget?" The chair was never meant to be filled. It was meant to be remembered. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag a sister's tears. Eventually, a nursing home in Georgia called Reina. They had found Elijah's sister. Loretta Brooks was 82 years old. Fragile but sharp, when Reina handed her the medal, Loretta began to cry. "My brother wrote me once from Vietnam," she said softly. "He told me he wasn't afraid of dying, only of being forgotten." Reina squeezed her hand. "He isn't forgotten anymore." Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the legacy. Elijah's medal began touring the country. Museums, schools, city halls. Everywhere it went, people shared stories of their own silent heroes. The medal had become more than an award. It had become a movement. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the quiet soldier. Before leaving office, President Trump made a private visit to Arlington. He stood alone at Elijah's grave, saluted. "Rest easy, soldier," he said. "You started something this country will never undo. He placed a commander's coin on the headstone, engraved with the words, "To those who stood alone, we stand with you now." Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag years later. Years passed. Captain Reina Torres eventually retired from the Air Force. But every Memorial Day, she returned to Elijah's grave. One year, she arrived and noticed a letter already resting beside the stone. It was written by a child. "My grandpa told me your story. I want to grow up and be a quiet hero like you." Raina smiled through tears. Elijah Brooks had once feared being forgotten. Instead, because one woman refused a medal, the world remembered him. And through him, every silent hero who ever stood for something greater than themselves. The end.